I'm Al Prophet, and this is the true story of the French Connection. One of the biggest criminal conspiracies in history, and how the U.S. government helped start it, support it, and protect it. Our story begins as World War II ends. After the war, drug use in America was at an all-time low due to disruptions in the supply chain during the war and the economic downturn of the Great Depression. So in the late 40s, the U.S. government had a real opportunity to possibly eliminate hard drugs as an American social problem. But instead, the U.S. government helped Asian, European, and American gangsters build an extremely sophisticated and global industry for heroin that's still going strong today, 70 years later. June 1940, the French government surrenders to the Nazis, and in the French colony of Indochina, the Vietnamese independence movement begins, led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. French Indochina was composed of the modern-day nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and was heavily populated by French businesses and French families. The independence movement began a war of terror against this French population, killing an estimated 150,000 civilians. The local French authorities, lacking support from a home country that was now under German occupation, began working with criminal elements, most notably gangsters from the French island of Corsica. Now, fighting back required money, and selling opium was the quickest way to get funds for buying weapons and hiring mercenaries on the international black market. There was a long history of the French selling opium in Indochina. In fact, on the eve of the Second World War, the opium tax accounted for 15% of total tax revenue there. The Vietnamese nationalists attacked the opium business as the ultimate example of the French colonial exploitation of the Vietnamese people.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low.
In the wake of Japan's defeat, communists, led by Mao Zedong, took power in China. The American government backed the remnants of the anti-communists led by General Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek reviews the armed forces of nationalist China on his island stronghold Formosa. While communism rules the mainland, Chiang Kai-shek defiantly parades his last forces on Formosa.
The communists quickly shut down opium and heroin production in China, and they brutally cracked down on organized crime, which caused the entire Shanghai criminal underworld to relocate en masse to the British colony of Hong Kong, taking their opium contacts and heroin production expertise with them.
As a free port, Hong Kong is a paradise to Far Eastern drug traffickers. Vigorously fighting the hideous evil that rots thousands throughout the world, the authorities turn tons of narcotics into harmless smoke.
As we get into the early 1950s and really settle into the Cold War, the U.S. government feels that the weak point in the Southeast Asian defense against communist China is Burma. So the U.S. begins arming the anti-communist Chinese KMT army, and they're stationed in the so-called Shan State, which is a very mountainous, very heavily jungled area, remote and cut off from the rest of the world. It sits between the borders of China, Burma, Laos, and Thailand. The Shan State was also one of the largest opium growing regions in the world. In 1950, the CIA purchased a bankrupt airline and used the fleet of planes to run weapons to the KMT in Shan province. The planes would return to Bangkok filled with opium. This operation became known as Air America. And the KMT's main opium customer in Bangkok was a man named General Phao. Phao was the commander of the Thai National Police Force. He was also the CIA's man in Thailand. From Bangkok, the Thai National Police would load the raw opium onto boats, and from there, it was escorted by the Maritime Police to rendezvous with large freighters bound for Singapore or Hong Kong to be processed into finished heroin and sent to the United States, usually via smuggling rings controlled by the same Corsican gangsters that were help fighting the Viet Minh communists in Indochina. The volume of this CIA-facilitated Thai heroin industry was gigantic. In 1957, a Thai military leader named Sarit Thanarat seized control of the country in a CIA-backed coup. His cousin was the stanchly anti-communist king of Laos, and when Field Marshal Sarett died in 1963, he had amassed over $150 million, making him more than a billionaire in today's money. There's no question the CIA knew what their Chinese and Thai allies were up to in the heroin business, and so did the American media. In 1952, the New York Times and other newspapers published detailed accounts of the KMT's role in the opium trade. But there's another component to this, the movement of the drugs into America and selling them on the streets. And this is where the American Mafia comes in, yet another CIA and US government ally. Charles Lucky Luciano was the man who organized American crime into the formal structure of mafia families controlled by a commission made up of crime bosses from around the country, what we today know as La Cosa Nostra. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was sent away to prison with a 30-year sentence, convicted of running a vast prostitution ring. But when the Second World War started, he made himself useful to the US government by using his criminal power to ensure that the docks along the east coast of the United States were not infiltrated by Nazi agents.
The Mafia. Aren't you getting into trouble when you use them during World War II? As we now recently read, we use them in New York City. I had only known that we'd used them in Marseille, on the docks there. Of course, it's a tricky business. It's a part of the evaluation that a good intelligence officer and a good policymaker will make in deciding whether to use any person or any instrument or any political organization. There's no question.
As a reward for his wartime efforts, Lucky Luciano gets released from U.S. prison in 1946 and deported back to Italy, where he quickly gets back into the heroin business. In December of 1946, Luciano oversaw a meeting of mafia leaders in Havana, Cuba, where the logistics of the post-war heroin trade was worked out. Initially, there were three sources of heroin: medical grade produced in Europe, Turkish opium processed into heroin in Marseille, France, and the Asian heroin coming from the CIA's proxy armies in Indochina and Thailand. The French Corsicans were responsible for smuggling most of this heroin into the US, no matter what the source. And part of the reason the Corsicans were such good smugglers was that they were helping the CIA in France and were being protected.
Now, these French Corsicans, who have had traditional ties with them for many, many years, arranged for the smuggling of the morphine base into France. Marseille is the capital of the Corsican underworld for all of France.
In the immediate aftermath of the war, the labor movement in Western Europe was growing increasingly militant in its battles with the government and private business.
In 1947, during a general strike, the communist unions were about to take over France. Competent observers feared that there would be a fall of the government, and the French people were hungry. Many of them took to the streets.
Strikes are the communist tactic as the Marshall Plan develops economic aid to support freedom in France. The American program bitterly opposed by communists.
The port city of Marseille, France, was a hotbed of radical labor, and as a part of a larger effort across all of Europe to suppress communism and the labor movement generally, the CIA's operatives supplied arms and money to the Corsican underworld to be used for assaulting picket lines and the harassment and even murder of key union officials and political agitators in Marseille.
It became a matter of breaking these strikes. And of course, if you want to break a strike, you go to boys who have big bare knuckles and who know how to wield the cudgels. And they turn to what could best be described as the Corsican Mafia, under the leadership of a well-known Corsican racketeer by the name of Ferri Pisani.
And probably he was involved in smuggling heroin going through Marseille, and he didn't need our money. My first job at CIA was case officer for French left operation, non-communist left.
Now we have a Corsican mafia with the carte blanche to do almost anything criminal they want, a resurgent Sicilian mafia that has American Lucky Luciano to help it, and another set of Corsican criminals in Southeast Asia working with the French intelligence services to fend off the Viet Minh. So the French Connection is now in place, and all the ingredients are set for the rise of the drug culture in America and eventually the so-called war on drugs, a war that killed far more people and destroyed exponentially more lives than the Cold War ever did. Heroin's becoming a real problem in the black communities of certain big cities, especially Harlem and New York City at this point.
The traffic starts in Manhattan. More readily obtainable in Manhattan, especially in the Harlem area, up around Lexington Avenue, from about 97th through around 135th Street, 116th Street, running east to west completely, 125th Street, and so many other spots. Probably take me all day to name them all.
An academic study by Columbia University on a residential block in East Harlem in the late 50s found that 1/3 of the residents were addicted to the drug.
The only thing that united Italians and Puerto Ricans together was the use of drugs.
So the real casualties in the first round of the Cold War were the American drug users, especially African Americans, who helped finance the CIA's Cold War maneuverings in Burma and Thailand in the 1950s with their addiction. So who were the Corsicans and why are they so important? Well, Corsican history is very interesting, very central to European history generally. Napoleon was Corsican. Corsica passed through the hands of the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, and even a bank, the Genoese Bank of St. George, took charge of the island at one point. Eventually, France controlled it, and Corsicans became spread out through the French colonial empire, including Indochina, the opium production center, also in Lebanon, another opium production center. As an island at the center of the Mediterranean trading routes and ruled by the same harsh law of vendetta and revenge that gripped Sicily, they made perfect allies for anyone that needed to keep important secrets, like drug dealers and the American Central Intelligence Agency. The roots of the French Connection go all the way back to the Nazi invasion of France during World War II. When the Nazis took power, they allowed a large part of southern France to remain semi-independent as a puppet state. Its capital was the spa town of Vichy. The Vichy government had responsibilities to the Nazis and set up a Gestapo-like force called the Carlinga. And the Carlinga was full of Corsican gangsters that used their powers to rob and steal from the population. Once the war ended, many of the Carlinga were executed by General Charles de Gaulle's new French government, but some of them escaped to South America along with various former Nazis, which is a long and interesting story in and of itself. One of these Carlinga veterans was a man named Auguste Record, a Corsican who set himself up in Argentina as a brothel owner. Then he became tied in with the opium processing labs being developed in Marseille right after the end of the war for processing Turkish opium. Auguste Record ran his empire mostly from Paraguay, a country that was very friendly to international criminals, especially Nazis and Nazi collaborators like the founders of the French Connection. 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu signals the final defeat of the French in Indochina, and the Communists take power in North Vietnam.
Bien Phu, the French fortress in Indochina, fell to the Vietnamese Communist Army. The garrison had been surrounded by Viet Minh forces. But despite massive reinforcements, 3,000 French paratroopers were dropped to help the besieging troops, and fierce resistance from the 16,000-strong French army, it was to no avail.
Coming on the heels of near defeat in the Korean War, the U.S. is deeply concerned about the expansion of Soviet and Chinese influence in Asia. The tiny kingdom of Laos became the center of America's secret war on communism in East Asia. Despite the fact that Laos was declared a neutral country under the same Geneva Peace Accords of 1954 that had divided Vietnam into a communist northern and non-communist southern partition, President Eisenhower began supplying the Laotian military with cash and weapons, and the CIA conducted intelligence operations from deep inside Laos. The Hmong were a small ethnic group living in the remote areas of Laos where the North Vietnamese were moving troops and equipment into attack South Vietnam. The Hmong were really turned into the CIA's private army in Laos, and the Hmong's main source of income was, of course, growing opium. In 1965, the new Laotian government kicked all the Corsicans out of the country, and the Corsicans had been the ones purchasing the opium grown in Laos and shipping it out to be processed into heroin. 1965 was also the year that the United States sent actual American soldiers to fight in Vietnam, and the war starts heating up. So the Hmong tribe now becomes very, very important to the American war effort in Vietnam.
The man who commands most of the secret army is General Vang Pao. He is a Hmong tribesman who worked closely with the CIA in organizing the Hill people. Today, along with his secret army role, he also commands all Lao forces in the most crucial military region.
With the Corsican pilots shut down, the CIA stepped in and provided transport for the Hmong opium crop, and the Hmong military leader, a man named Vang Pao, actually started manufacturing heroin himself, and the chief of staff of the Laotian army was suspected of operating the largest heroin refinery in the world at the time.
Frequently, he is accompanied by an aide-de-camp with a briefcase full of money. Vang Pao and his men received their money direct from the CIA. The Hmong are a tough and stoic race, and as long as Vang Pao is willing to lead, they seem willing to follow.
Now, much of this heroin was being sold directly to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. According to academic researcher Alfred McCoy, all three of the major political groups allied to the U.S. in South Vietnam ran heroin distribution networks. Members of the South Vietnamese parliament were actually caught smuggling large amounts of heroin into the country, but of course, no legal action was taken. In effect, the entire South Vietnamese government, our ally in the war on communism, was dealing heroin to American troops. By September of 1971, there was an addiction crisis amongst American soldiers. Seemingly unlimited quantities of heroin were available at every U.S. military base. Army medical doctors estimated that up to 15% of GIs in Vietnam were heroin users.
And the junkies are coming home, angry and scared and strung out. In New York City, there are 300,000 Vietnam-era veterans, and 40,000 of them are addicts. Most of them began using heroin, barbiturates, and amphetamines in Vietnam.
I am a Vietnam veteran, a ex-Marine medic, and an ex-morphine addict. A Marine that was in my company was with us for about 2 weeks, heard noise behind him, turned around and sprayed the area. He hit 3 women and some children. This is a normal reaction, but when he put the gun up to his shoulder and took individual aim, he was committing murder. That night, when we set up our perimeter, I shot morphine for the first time because of what had happened that day to me. This was the only way that I could rationalize why I was there.
Back in France, the Corsican Mafia had insinuated themselves even deeper into the political system after the May uprisings of 1968, when French President Charles de Gaulle's government was nearly brought down by the left-wing student movement and a general strike of 10 million workers.
A 4-week revolutionary outburst in France shook the world by their ferocity and by the fact that they took place in one of the world's most civilized capitals. Not since the liberation in 1944 had the streets of Paris seen such a battle.
In his desperation to take back the streets of Paris from the students and the workers, de Gaulle created a group known as the Civic Action Service. The Civic Action Service was made up of petty thugs and criminals, many of them Corsican, who were once again given get-out-of-jail-free cards in exchange for their head-busting work for the French government. Whether it was raw opium coming from Turkey or processed heroin coming from Asia, the Corsican smugglers had ratcheted up their smuggling into the United States, the highest levels of de Gaulle's government. In the fall of 1970, for example, when the police charged a French Civic Action Service member with smuggling 2 heroin shipments into the United States, he threatened the French police, telling them, "We have protection, so watch your step." As heroin-addicted American GIs were coming back home, they brought their addictions home with them.
And most of them came home with less than honorable, drug-related discharges. These GIs are ineligible for veterans' educational, home loan, and employment benefits. They get no long-term VA medical or psychological treatment for their addiction. They're offered only methadone, a numbing drug with which some men can function and others can't.
Back in 1963, less than 3% of African American adult males across the United States were injecting heroin. By 1972, that number was a shocking 20%. Many of them former GIs. Guys like Nicky Barnes and Frank Superfly Lucas and many others across the country made millions and millions of dollars feeding the habit of all these new addicts. One medical researcher discovered that nearly 7% of all the factory workers he tested were in fact heroin addicts. An interesting side story here is that of a black heroin kingpin from Brooklyn by way of North Carolina named Frank Matthews. Matthews was possibly the single largest heroin dealer in the U.S., and as I talk about in my documentary, The Frank Matthews Story, he was getting his drugs from Corsicans down in Venezuela. And this is per the federal prosecutor himself. Elements of Matthews' supply chain in Venezuela were protected by the CIA, and when Matthews was indicted in 1972, he was arrested and posted bond.
We had indicted Frank, and our indictment included about 20 foreign defendants, and including some Venezuelan customs agents, and Jules Serini, the courier who came from Marseille with 22 kilos of heroin. Serini had been told that the bribes were paid and he'd have no trouble coming into Caracas with his suitcases. He was in fact arrested with 22 kilos and 100% pure heroin. Matthews paid cash for it, and they would have had backed up 22 kilos every month if they got away with it. Miller and I were requested to report to the criminal division immediately for a meeting with the CIA. And the general counsel told us, under no circumstances is your indictment going to be presented as it is. We are lopping off the entire Venezuelan portion, the international portion of your indictment. But there are international ramifications as to things we're doing in Venezuela and with the Russians that we can't talk about. Need I say more? And we said, we understand, and they said, have a nice day.
He disappeared in 1973 with an estimated $90 million fortune. And despite a massive manhunt by the DEA and U.S. Marshals, Frank Matthews never been found dead or alive. And while I have no smoking gun proof of this, a disappearance this thorough has the hallmark of a CIA operation. The French-Corsican connection began falling apart in 1972, not coincidentally at the same exact time as American involvement in Vietnam began to wind down. And also the same time that Frank Matthews was finally arrested and then went missing. In 1970, the widow of a Civic Action Service leader who'd worked as de Gaulle's personal chauffeur was arrested with 50 kilos of heroin. In April of '71, Laotian diplomats were caught bringing in a load of 60 kilos of pure heroin. And the biggest scandal of all happened in November of '71 when the state of New Jersey indicted French Colonel Paul Fournier, one of the French intelligence service's top supervisory agents, for conspiring to smuggle 100 pounds of heroin into the United States. In January of 1973, peace accords were signed between Vietnam and the United States. U.S. troop withdrawals began immediately. The CIA also trimmed down its operations in the region, and the heroin supply in the U.S. immediately tightened. Between 1972 and '73, use declined by an estimated 1/3 in the US, while American troop levels in Vietnam declined by over 90%. Was it a coincidence that the heroin supply crashed right when the Vietnam War ended? No way. Vietnam and heroin went together like a hand and glove, and it's also no coincidence that the French Connection was finally ended only when France and the Americans were kicked out of Vietnam.
The majority of my friends from Brownsville, Harlem, and Memphis died. Some of them don't have no motherfucking waist from down to up. Some of them can't see. Some of them are just shell shocked. You dig it? I was lucky. I got a motherfucking Chinese-made rifle bullet in my motherfucking foot. It make me feel like I want to kill every motherfucker who made me go over there. Every motherfucker who said I had to go. That goes from the motherfucker who put the stamp on the letter, who sent me the token, to the motherfucking bus that took me to Fort Dix. Every single one of them motherfuckers.
So there you have it. The initial framework of the global heroin trade was supported by the US government. Initially, the primary victims of heroin were blacks and Puerto Ricans, but as the youth culture of the 60s got drawn into drug use, the business exploded, and then the Vietnam War really kicked it into overdrive, and illegal drugs became a permanent problem that cut across every spectrum of American society. And that's the true story of the French Connection.